Iran is marking the 39th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. We will take a closer look at the economic and political situation of one of the biggest players in the Middle East. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hundreds of thousands of people rallied in cities across Iran this Sunday to mark the 39th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. In the capital, Tehran, they gathered on the central Azadi, or Freedom Square. The flag-waving crowd chanted slogans against the United States and Israel. The rallies commemorate the ousting of the US-backed Iranian Shah by followers of the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. Speaking to the crowd, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani called for unity after a series of protests last month against the government. To discuss current conditions in Iran, we welcome Dorothy Parvaz, a global policy reporter with ThinkProgress. Mohsen Milani is a professor of politics at the University of South Florida, and he joins us from Tampa. And Trita Parsi is founder and president of the National Iranian American Council. He's also here with us in the studio. Welcome to all of you. Trita, let me start with you. We look at that 1979 revolution in Iran, a seismic event, not just in the Middle East. The tremors were felt throughout the world. Millions of people on the streets, the Shah overthrown, Ayatollah Khomeini takes over. What, in your view, was the catalyst for that revolution?
Well, if you take a look at what happened back then, you had some of the factors that you also see right now. You had increased income inequality, significant repression taking place, and also expectations that things would be moving in the right direction. And many of those things didn't pan out because particularly in 1977, you had a significant economic crisis that significantly worsened the economic situation, which all created these various factors. But compared to what you have right now, you had very strong organization outside of the country, you had strong leadership, etc. None of that is present right now, and I think you have a population that, despite significant difficulties, and it's very, very clear that they're very unhappy about a lot of different things, from the economy to the social and political situation, they don't seem to be in that type of a revolutionary mood precisely because of the experience of 1979, precisely because of the experience of seeing what has happened in Syria after 2011. So despite a lot of loss of confidence for the ability for the system to reform itself, I don't think we're seeing that shifting towards an all-out revolutionary mood.
Mohsen, the United States was initially responsible for the installation of the Shah as leader of Iran. That's after it overthrew the democratically elected government of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The CIA was involved in that. How did the United States initially respond to the overthrow of the Shah in 1979?
Well, originally, initially, President Carter, who had campaigned on human rights, respect for human rights, put a lot of pressure on Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the last monarch of Iran, to open up the political process. And once the Shah responded to that pressure and tried to open up the political process, then we began to see a split or a division within the Carter administration. There were those in the State Department who favored putting more pressure on the Shah, open up the Iranian system even more, but there were those in the National Security Council, as well as in the Pentagon, who correctly argued that if we put pressure on the Shah, and if he opens up the political process, we might not be able to control what happens. And in fact, if you look at the behavior of the Carter administration in the last year of the Shah's rule, you would see that there was clear confusion about what was taking place in Iran and what the US was doing. One day, President Carter would ask the Shah to open up the process, and the next day, when the Shah would repress those who had protested against them, he would oppose those moves. And the end result was that they lost the most important ally of the United States in the Middle East.
Dorothy, if we go back to that period, not long after Ayatollah Khomeini took power, we had the Iranian hostage crisis. That's when Iranian activists took over the US embassy, held US personnel hostage for more than a year. How much of a turning point was that in the relationship between the United States and Iran?
Well, it can't be underplayed. I mean, 444 days of Americans watching their, fellow citizens in Iran basically locked up and worried about them. It's not. There was no way of. There's no off-ramp from that tension. That was a seismic, massive error on behalf of the Iranians at the time. And it has led to nothing but decades of sanctions and acrimony. Now, arguably, even before that, the relationships weren't great. I mean, if you look at going back to the 40s and 50s, even the relationship between Iran and the U.S., there were some tensions. But since then, that's how we've landed here, is decades of sanctions and acrimony, leading specifically from that event.
Trita, if we go back to 1979, we look at those protests, as you pointed out, they were both economic and political. Now, if we look at the protests, President Hassan Rouhani did say in that speech over the weekend that he warned, rather, that popular support for the Iranian leadership was at risk because of these protests. Let's listen to what he said.
People's protests do not solely concern economic issues. The people have criticisms regarding social, political, and foreign policy as well. We must hear them out, and we must know what they want.
Now, President Rouhani also called on leaders to heed the lessons of 1979. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, because the protests have become an instrument that the various political factions are using right now against each other. And Rouhani is trying to take some of this energy as a result of these protests to put pressure on the conservatives. And essentially, part of the reason why he's shifting it and saying it's not just economic is because he's the one who's most vulnerable if this is just an economic protest. But if he shifts it and he says, look, this is also about social and political issues, as well as foreign policy issues, then he's kind of shifting it towards the conservatives because they are the ones that are most vulnerable when it comes to political and social issues. So I think that to this degree, there's been a success with these protests because they actually generated a completely different conversation at the elite level. And one of the most fascinating things with this protest that really contrasted with previous protests is not just the protests themselves, but the government's reaction to the protests. The reaction of the government right now compared to 2009 is quite different. Not to say that there hasn't been repression, but the fact that Rouhani comes out and says that the protesters have a right to protest, even when they're calling for the death of the supreme leader, that is quite a shift. And I think it's a recognition that they understand if they just go at this very, very forcefully, as they did before, they are likely going to make the situation worse because the frustrations of the population are not going to go away by just simply intensifying the repression.
You know, Trita, we often hear that there are two centers of power in Iran, one led by Hassan Rouhani, the president, the other led by the religious establishment. On these particular issues, are they in sync?
There's a simplification to just divide it into two, obviously. Yeah. But on these specific issues, there don't seem to be too much in sync. Part of what sparked the protest was that there was actually hardline elements that were organizing this against Rouhani, partly because he was actually targeting some of their sources of funding coming from the state budget. So there is a very, very deep competition and rivalry between the various factions that is the backdrop to why this came at this moment and how it has developed.
Mohsen, during the 1979 revolution, there was almost universal support for the Ayatollah Khomeini and for the revolution at that time. Could you say the same about the situation now, or is the opposition now more fragmented, more divided?
You cannot compare the two situations. In 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini had emerged as the undisputed leader of the revolutionary movement. Moreover, and much more importantly, he represented a cross-cutting alliance of different social classes in Iran. In other words, there is no possibility of launching a revolution in the modern era until and unless there is an alliance between different classes, not just one, but different classes. In 1979, we had the merchant class, we had the working class, the modern middle class. They were all united in one thing, to overthrow the Shah's despotic regime. And at the same time, there was unanimous agreement that Ayatollah Khomeini has to be the leader of that movement. Therefore, you cannot compare this to what is taking place in Iran today. If you look at the protest movement that started the waning days of 2017, the major difference between what happened then and what happened in 1979 is that no identifiable leader has emerged from the recent protest movement. And you cannot have a revolution unless you have a vision, unless you have a leader, unless you have an organization, and unless you have a concrete political agenda. None of them exist in Iran today, and they all existed in 1979. And if I may add one important point about your question about the hostage crisis. In Iran, the 1979 revolution went through two momentous phases. Phase one was the overthrow of the Shah's regime, putting an end to the monarchical system. The second momentous event was the hostage crisis. As a result of the hostage crisis, the Islamicists, the Islamic fundamentalists, were able to defeat all their rivals and consolidate the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Dorothy, to Mohsen's point, when we look at the protests taking place in Iran right now, would it be fair to say that the protesters are not looking for an alternate leadership? They're looking for genuine economic grievances to be addressed?
Well, correct, but to Trita's point, you can't really entirely separate economic issues from political issues. A lot of these economic issues stem from corruption, lack of accountability, joblessness, all that. But no, I mean, right now, what people, I think, are looking for is stability. They want economic stability, and they want some more social freedoms. So no, you're not really seeing a lot of people taking to the streets saying, you know, we no longer want an Islamic Republic as much. I mean, there's a minor group of protesters asking for that. But largely, they want the sorts of changes that would make their lives easier. So, again, more jobs, slightly more social freedoms, those sorts of things.
Trita, let's bring it right up to what's going on today. Let's talk about the Iranian nuclear deal. That's something that you've studied very closely. You've written a book on the subject. It now appears that President Trump is intent on scrapping that deal, accusing Iran of violating parts of that deal. What does that tell you about trust between these two countries? Can that ever recover?
Some modicum of trust had been established as a result of this deal. And it's quite sad to see how quickly that has been destroyed by the conduct of the Trump administration. The Trump administration's strategy right now, I think, actually is to deliberately create uncertainty about the future and the survivability of this deal, because they have figured out that uncertainty actually is a de facto sanction. As long as companies and particularly banks are uncertain as to whether this deal will survive or not, they are staying out of the Iranian market. They are not financing major projects, which is exactly what sanctions would have achieved. So by simply creating, essentially manufacturing this uncertainty, I'm sure you've noticed that every time there is a deadline for the president to renew waivers, no one knows what he's going to do until the very last moment, including his principals such as Secretary Tillerson and Mattis. I think that is very deliberate at this stage, because it's just happened 3 times in a row, and I don't think that's a coincidence. That is a strategy to make sure that the deal is dying, that it dies, without the United States actually deliberate or directly pulling the plug on it.
Mohsen, what is your view on U.S. behavior concerning this deal?
Well, it's very clear that from the very beginning, President Trump had 2 important agendas. Number one was to undermine the nuclear deal, and as Dr. Parsi has correctly said, to create uncertainty about the future of this nuclear deal, because as long as there is uncertainty, we are not going to see major Western investments in Iran. But there is a second dimension to his policy. He believes that Iran has made huge advances in its regional policies. Iran has become a major player in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and to a lesser extent in Yemen. And therefore, his policy is designed to contain the Islamic Republic, to confront the Islamic Republic, so that they can push back Iran and prevent Iran from further expanding its influence throughout the Middle East. I think he is planning to pursue these dual policies in order to weaken the Islamic Republic and to undermine its policies in the region.
Okay, there is a lot more to discuss. We're going to take a quick break right now. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.